I get sad. A lot. Especially with like big things, parents fighting and you hearing it from upstairs, losing out on a job that you really wanted, or when bands you've never met disband for personal reasons. It's not a small deal, bands breaking up. It's dramatic. Panic at the Disco's breakup has so much lore that you could fit it into a Netflix drama. I'm hoping they do, because I really want to figure out what happened there. The Beatles breakup was so fucking iconic, basically, that Yoko became a shorthand for any person who wanted to break up a cool group of dudes. And Van Halen broke up so many times that they ended up 3 times on a top 50 list for worst band breakups of all time by the Rolling Stones. Van Halen was like a toxic ass relationship. If Van Halen was my friend, I would tell them to stop going back to each other. So I'll admit, when I found out that alt-rock band The Shins had broken up its original lineup in 2009, I went looking for a similar story because I like the drama. I wanted to read a story about the lead singer and songwriter James Mercer having slung his guitar at his former bandmates, keyboardist Martin Crandall, guitarist Dave Hernandez, and drummer Jesse Sandoval, and called it that new slang, or maybe wincing my guitar away. But this wasn't a messy story like that. It was almost surgical, which was even more interesting to me because of the conversations it ended up sprouting about songwriting versus playing songs. It's like going into a sitcom expecting like a normal funny episode. I guess the funny would be the terrible band breakups, but instead you get a bottle episode where there's thought-provoking concepts about the medium. It is an interesting story, so I'm gonna tell it to you. The Shins has always been James Mercer's band. It started as a vehicle for his songwriting that he got his friends to help him produce. But those first 3 albums, Oh Inverted World, Shoots Too Narrow, and Wincing the Night Away, all more or less had the same lineup. And when people interviewed the Shins, they interviewed them as a band together, or at least mostly together, if they could get them.
And what instrument you play?
I'm Dave, I play guitar.
And I sing.
I'm Marty and I play the keyboard.
So who's the best?
Me. Probably James.
Oh, the Shins just sounds like something, bloody and gory.
Like a slab of shin, like shin meat.
We used to be death and
We used to
destruction.
actually not be a band, we used to just sacrifice like lambs, women.
Things,
We all
frogs,
came together in our
friends.
love of virgin blood.
And most of the time when you saw the band, they were goofing off and they just appeared to be good friends, so it was a nice idea that the Shins was this alt-rock band that bounced off each other and really worked well together. Up until 2009 when James Mercer fired the rest of the band, deeming it an aesthetic choice. If your friend fires you as an aesthetic choice, that's not your friend. It's a decision that haunts the albums that Mercer has put out as the Shins ever since, making spooky noises when the albums are trying to go to sleep. And I think that part of the reason that it was such a hard thing for audiences to process might have to do with the band's origins as Flake.
How good was Flake? We were great.
Yeah?
It was a pretty cool band. I mean, we had moments on our records, that were cool. I think we were caught up in the pavement hysteria sort of thing that was going on in the 90s. I mean, we sort of emulated the Arches of Loaf pavement sound, and we were pretty typical of the indie bands at the time. Real power pop stuff. Still had one foot in the punk rock aesthetic,
Mm-hmm. See, while the Shins is supposed to be Mercer's thing, he was in a band called Flake before that had basically the same lineup as the Shins. And so when people thought about the Shins, they often also thought about Flake. The lineup was important to the DNA of the band for a long time, and the idea was that the Shins was just Flake retooled.
And I had these songs that I was writing that didn't work in Flake. The guys just, especially Neil at the time, who was the other principal songwriter for Flake, he just didn't like that stuff, He didn't like oldies. He didn't like Kinks and stuff like that. He just thought it was, boring. And so that was the thing about Flake. It was much more of a real collaborative band.
As Robert Levine explains in his article for Spin called The Shins' Big Adventure, Mercer first joined Superchunk-influenced Flake, which included every future Shin but Hernandez, before starting the Shins as a side project with Sandoval. Mercer himself even says in a later interview with Kelly Clark for The Spin, there are things that those guys can do that no one else can. If a song's gotta have them, that's what it's gotta have. Even though Mercer was the important one, through the third album it was kinda safe to assume that the Shins was like a pizza. It's about the whole thing, not just the biggest slice. And come on, man, it's the same pizza as before, it just has different motivation. But being in a famous band is like a friendship compactor, and it is torn apart even the closest of friendships. When Tim McDonald interviewed Mercer for Mother Jones, he noted that he had come away from the Wincing the Night Away tour exhausted and ready to quit, with Mercer himself questioning what do you do when the band you've been doing for 10 years you decide you no longer want to do.
It was just getting a little bit much, and I wanted something new. I thought, wouldn't it be cool to collaborate with somebody, and I just wanted to break out of this repetitive cycle of, touring and then coming home and writing and then learning the latest software, because, when you're doing that stuff, the industry is changing, the software is all changing as I'm out on tour and stuff, and I get back, I have to learn it again.
You can even kind of see it on this clip from an episode of Behind the Scenes.
Camera always on, we're always funny. I know. I've done a free moment to just decompress.
We're gonna do the shots. What are we doing here? I'm waiting here.
What do they think music? What do you think the life of a rock star is like?
Kind of seems like the band had just run its course, and maybe they were all just done with each other. It was just time to stop. But that wasn't the picture that the Shins ended up painting after they broke up. In an interview with Pitchfork right after the band broke up, Mercer explains that he started to have some production ideas that he wanted to do that basically required some different people.
It's not that, these musicians are better. It's that when you work with somebody new, you get a whole new perspective on your song.
Kind of seems like he wanted to do like a scaled down Gorillaz thing, where Damon Albarn, the primary musician for the band, brings in different people for every album to give them different sounds. Although James Mercer was still at the front and center of the Shins, and he didn't have cartoons by the amazing Jamie Hewlett. Also, unlike Gorillaz, which had the core concept from the beginning that they were different musicians, this was a band that had an established lineup that people cared about. It was just a little odd for it to be this new thing when it was this old thing, but don't worry, Jesse Sandoval comes in to clear up that he unequivocally got fired. Sandoval explains that James had mentioned a long time ago that he wanted to blow the band up. He was frustrated, and Sandoval speculates that the fact that he wasn't a slick drummer may have had something to do with it. Part of this decision was influenced by Mercer's work with Brian Burton. He explains to Tim McDonald that working with Broken Bells had really opened him up to the idea of working with new people. Sandoval's interview echoes this sentiment, with Sandoval explaining that he knows that working in Los Angeles put James in a position where he didn't have to do 15 takes. While Mercer seems to be pushing the change as like a different sound for the band, Sandoval seems to believe it is a better sound that Mercer was looking for. Although Mercer does push against this idea, reminding Kelly Clark that both Marty and Dave play on Port of Morrow, adding that he's trying not to think about it as a firing, but more as a new phase in the process. But, if he was tired of the Shins and tired of the Shins sound, it doesn't really make a lot of sense that he kept performing under the name The Shins. It'd be like if Paul McCartney tried to keep being the Beatles after all the Beatles left. That wouldn't make any sense because the Beatles, albeit a little bit more well known for their collaborative work, were all a part of the band. You wouldn't expect any one of them to try and be the Beatles alone. Sandoval speculates that if he had his way, James probably would have killed the Shins, and that management was probably telling James, you can't start over, you built this name, you built this brand, why would you want to start over? What probably adds to this is the idea that James was into auteurs who presented themselves as bands, as he told Emily Clark, adding that he really liked the concept of the Shins and figured he could just take it along with him. Why not? So, yeah, I kinda understand the decision to keep the name. It seems like if you're gonna go ahead and pretend to be a band, why not just pretend to be the band that you claim creative control over anyways? If he wasn't gonna release music as James Mercer, he probably didn't think there was a reason to start a new band called the Kneecaps for all his personal work. Still, I think it might be hard for audiences to accept the idea that something is fresh when you still release it under the name of the band that you had with the guys that you fired. When the first album without the original lineup came out, Port of Morrow, people were really interested in how it sounded versus the other three with the lineup. The Guardian's Alex Petridis adds to the end of his review of Port of Morrow that it's tempting to say the only lives Port of Morrow will change are those of the bandmates who were fired during its making. Although he does add that there's more than enough magic to make it worthwhile. So it's like a sweet review. The AV Club's Stephen Hayden describes Port of Morrow as what amounts to a solo record that Mercer has needlessly attached to a band identity that he has outgrown. Mercer said, "I'm the Shins," and everybody else said, "No, you're not." Seems like Mercer wasn't really counting on people being invested in the idea that they were a unit as the Shins, and that all together they made the first three albums special. Maybe the Shins couldn't exist without Mercer, but it didn't exist without all four of them. If I were at the end of a business meeting with James Mercer, where studio executives were telling him he should keep the name of the Shins, I would probably say, hey, maybe if we're going for a new thing, we should just go for a new thing, because people are not going to understand a new thing if you just put it as the old thing. Mercer would then obviously reply, "Stop time traveling to key moments in my life trying to change the way that my band is going to turn out." I like the new albums he's released a lot, and I like the idea that they're all credit to his songwriting. I think that the Shins has to be thought of in two different ways, and it's not as simple as old Shins versus new Shins. There's the Shins, the songwriting project that James has been working on since the very beginning, that includes all the albums and the lyrics on the albums and the vibes of the albums that are really important, and there is a through line in all of them. There's a reason that they can all be considered Shins projects. However, if you're talking about the band's meteoric rise to success, what made those first three albums so special and perhaps different from what follows, you're talking about the Shins as the four-piece. You're talking about them as a band, because even if James was in charge of the songwriting and wrote a lot of the songs, the way they played the instruments is on the album. The things that they can and were able to do and practice doing and put their work into is also there. And I think that people like that and like the idea that that's there. And so you just have to think about all of them when you're talking about how those first three records especially are special. Each of those first three albums builds upon and refines on everything about the music, the instrumentation, they put together the lyrics, and I think that it's important to realize that everybody played a part in that. I think that before James Mercer could be the Shins, he first had to be a part of the Shins. But it wouldn't hurt to put one album out as the Wrists. Maybe then we all wouldn't be so confused.